Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. This is the third in my series covering Ian Fleming's original James Bond novels. That of course means this video is dealing with Moonraker, the third of the Bond novels, coming after Casino Royale and Live and Let Die, and just as with the past two books, a real departure from those. So this is Fleming still very much building the world of James Bond. But interestingly, it is a complete shift away from what we saw in Live and Let Die as an out-and-out adventure novel. And it's also not quite the same as Casino Royale, which is a very focused character study, really. What Moonraker is as a novel is really, it's a blending of those two books and styles and approaches, and is, of course, also the Bond novel that doesn't actually leave Great Britain and takes place entirely in London and also out in the countryside in Kent, among other areas. So it doesn't have the usual sort of globetrotting aspect to it. It makes the book very unique. It's also, it has a certain literary flavor, if you will, for lack of a better term, because this is all about character. It's the book where we get the most detail about Bond's home life, his life day-to-day at the office at MI6. We get the most details essentially about his everyday existence when not on a life-or-death assignment, of which he can only expect to maybe see 2 to 3 of those per year before he is either killed off, as he reflects, or reaches a sort of mandatory retirement age at about 45 or so. So Bond's fatalism and cynicism is on full display, especially when he's in essentially non-action duties, or as Fleming would have Bond put it, essentially trying to fight off the arms of the soft life trying to stifle him. So it is a novel that is rich in texture. It is not necessarily as bold, obviously, as Live and Let Die, which is Fleming's most out-and-out action-adventure novel, and certainly one of his pulpiest. Again, I think the best way to look at it is that it's the third novel. It's Fleming building on what he had started, and interestingly, he's pulling elements from his previous two James Bond novels and sort of fusing them into something new, and also it taking place primarily in the English countryside, and it being a mystery that has to be uncovered at an estate. It starts to have the flavor of more of a classical mystery. You could almost say that this is, in at least certain ways, Fleming playing in more of the Agatha Christie world, if you will, because that's the flavor I think you get in Moonraker. And what's especially rewarding is how much character detail you get, how much of Bond's day-to-day life you get as setup, and the fact that Fleming isn't afraid to go for a downer of an ending after the action finale. This is also one of the novels that has not truly been adapted for the films in terms of its story being adapted beat for beat. The Eon film of the same name differs in quite a number of areas, obviously, but the core idea is still there. Eventually, they would use the overall plot ideas that were very much more on the back burner in the 1979 film in Die Another Day. So this is one of the novels that it has not been adapted specifically to a film, and that has actually replicated everything from the book, but it has not one film, but at least two, and then there's even a third Eon film that pulls elements from the novel that weren't used to the other two films. So this is a novel that's actually been kind of worked into 3 different Eon films, but the actual novel as it stands has not been adapted to film exactly as it was written. It's also very much locked in place to the 1950s due to the fact that it's about the development of rocketry and the sort of emerging space race that was coming to pass and really taking the world's fascination by storm. Its themes and the fact that it was released in 1955, I've never seen this confirmed anywhere, but I think it has to be said that Fleming was most likely inspired to delve into, if not out-and-out science fiction, at least adjacent science fiction themes due to the overwhelming success of the Quatermass Experiment by Nigel Neal, which was a BBC television serial that basically the entire country stopped and watched. And then, of course, Hammer made the incredible Mass masterpiece film version. And then, of course, the sequel, Quatermass 2, was very quickly rushed into production, first as another Nigel Neal BBC serial, and then another Hammer film. So I think that sort of, at least possibly, because it fits the timeline, may have been the impetus that sort of pushed Fleming to take James Bond into, at the very least, elements of rocketry and space travel, and this was leading into the development of the space race, which would really get kicked into high gear with the launch of Sputnik just a couple years later. So it's a good point to have this story in terms of where it falls within the James Bond canon, but it is at first a bit odd when you come to it, because if you're a fan, you're most likely thinking of the 1979 film of the same name, which is dramatically different. So this is a novel that usually fans absolutely love. Some even proclaim it as their favorite. It is definitely one of the books that has much more of that literary flavor, and it's one of the standout Bond novel experiences in the Fleming canon, because you get so much of Bond's internal monologue and his own basic daily activities when he's not on an assignment. So we get an even greater building of Bond's character. Now, to talk about the overall plot to a degree, and I will, as usual, try to keep these relatively spoiler-free, but try to pepper in enough analysis for fans to get something out of this. James Bond is confronted, essentially, by the case of Sir Hugo Drax, an incredibly rich industrialist who has donated his fortune and his technology to England, essentially giving them the Moonraker, his extremely advanced missile system, essentially, to give Great Britain a standing on the world stage, and in terms of the ongoing arms race and the Cold War, to essentially give them equal or even superior footing to others who have far greater technology than what Great Britain had before Drax's incredible gift. Drax also has an incredible story in terms of his history of being a war veteran who was incredibly disfigured and got amnesia and basically had to rebuild his entire life. And over many years and some rather interesting, unexplained gains of capital, cornered the market on certain metals and certain elements that were necessary for rocketry, which is how he developed his industrial complex and developed the Moonraker project. This is all fine and dandy, and Drax is essentially a national hero overnight, but there's one small problem. And this is what M calls Bond into the office for, and this is one of the wonderful times where Fleming describes M as a little bit reluctant to explain what's going on, and calls Bond James instead of 007, meaning that it is a personal matter. Because M is a member of the incredible private club Blades, where there is constant high-stakes gambling going on between various knights of the realm and other wealthy Englishmen. But the issue is that Sir Hugo Drax is a member, and for whatever reason, he seems to be cheating at cards. Not that he even needs to for any reason, and no one knows how he's doing it. But to avoid creating a national scandal, M essentially enlists Bond, since he is the greatest card player in the service, as established in Casino Royale, to try and spot what Drax is doing and see if there was a way to basically put an end to it without everything blowing up in their faces. So it's a different opening to a Bond novel, and one that immediately gets the reader's attention because it's all a personal matter. Well, the stakes are high in terms of the gambling table, but the actual it's a personal battle of wills between eventually Bond and Drax. It is not an earth-shattering plot. It is a matter between two men, is what it boils down to. And this is the culmination of how the book is at the opening in terms of the first act, lulling the reader into the day-to-day existence of an MI6 agent when not on a life or death assignment. So this is essentially the highlight before Bond is actually given an assignment. So the whole first act of the book revolves around and really builds up to the card game, the first meeting between Bond and Drax at Blade. Blades, where Drax has indeed been cheating at bridge and wiped the floor with all the members and never lost. As usual, Fleming describes everything in this sequence to the absolute most incredible detail. First, Bond and M essentially gamble and have dinner together at Blades, and it is quite possibly the best described and best food or dinner sequence in any of Fleming's Bond novels, and that's saying something. It is just such an incredibly realized sequence that reading the text, the reader can actually visualize every last detail, and you just get lost in the ambiance and the world of Blades and this incredible meal that Bond and M are enjoying, and the dialogue between the two. And since they're out of the office, it's so much more personable, and you learn so much about both characters in terms of how they really are as people, what their foibles are. You get such a rich sense of each person because they're outside of the office and they're interacting, but they're preparing for this game and trying to walk on eggshells in order to avoid a scandal. But it's also a great introduction to Drax, who is a larger-than-life villain character and is in some ways has elements of both Le Chiffre and Mr. Big, who preceded him, but is also a much more flamboyant and over-the-top character due to his emotions being very much on the surface and his penchant for being loud and boisterous, which does not endear him to Bond, M, or the reader. It is a perfect introduction to the character, and his outlandishness is topped off by having an enormous mustache and teeth that sort of jut out somewhat, and rather nervous habits of certain types. So he is a very unique character and yet another of Fleming's masterful villains, but it is left up to the reader to uncover just how villainous Drax is, because after the game at Blades is concluded, of course not after Bond downs an entire bottle of champagne filled with Benzedrine, probably not a good idea to do that, so one should not replicate that. Of course, I myself am still tempted to put pepper in things that I drink, because Bond does this at Blades and reminisces about how he discovered this trick after drinking a lot of bathtub liquor, and the pepper drags the fusel oil to the bottom of improperly prepared vodka. Not that I drank, but I read the novel as a child, and you used to put pepper in orange juice. It's actually kind of tasty, I have to admit. But anyhow, after the Blade sequence is concluded, and that is a real dramatic highlight, things seem to cool back down, and Bond believes he's just going to have to go back to his sort of humdrum, quite frankly, boring in aspects everyday existence. Yet he is pretty much immediately called into the office because, ironically, an incident happened up at Drax's plant and facility. The head of security has been killed by one of the workers, who is, interestingly, like all the workers, a German who was essentially imported into the country and given special permission to work on the Moonraker project because Drax pretty much insisted on using various German crew members. But essentially, Bond is dispatched to take the place of the security man just days before the launch of the Moonraker in this big public spectacle that the whole nation will be watching. And also, he's informed that the reason why the head of security was supposedly killed is that the German was in love with the secretary, Gala Brand. But Gala is actually an agent of Scotland Yard who was placed with Drax at the start of the Moonraker project to essentially keep an eye on things, and so ever since she's been carrying out her duties and working very hard with the rest of the team to make the Moonraker a success. So Bond is dispatched up to the Drax estate, not knowing what his reception will be and not really knowing exactly what he's going to be able to do to prevent anything from going wrong with the project that's already almost at completion. And this is where we transition out of London into the countryside, and it slows down the pace a little bit. And this is really where you get that sort of English manor house mystery atmosphere in terms of the book. So this is where you could say that Fleming might be playing around a little bit in the Agatha Christie realm. And it's fascinating seeing Bond in this type of different locale, and essentially strings had to be pulled and red tape had to be cut for Bond to be working within the country, because technically this should be a Scotland Yard or MI5 job. So Bond is very much out of his element. So it's interesting to see the character very much out of his comfort zone a little bit, and having to go into the lion's den, he thinks, of basically someone who he has, shall we say, royally pissed off. But interestingly, any animosity is essentially buried once Bond arrives, and he has to acclimatize himself to the incredible facility, actually seeing the breathtaking Moonraker rocket for the first time and being given the tour, but also meeting the various crew members, noting that they are all German, and that Drax's right-hand man, Krebs, is rather a suspicious character. Fleming even describes that he has some reminiscent qualities of a Peter Lorre, and I don't know how much more you can stress that somebody is a bit suspicious when you specifically mention that they have some classic Peter Lorre-isms in terms of their overall demeanor. And of course, Bond also first meets Gala Brand, who is working undercover as Drax's secretary. She is very much a career policewoman who is at the top of her game and dedicated to the assignment and doesn't want anything to do with Bond. So there's a nice professional relationship that develops, and it's nice to see a strong female character who is very much able to operate on her own, and has been doing so for months by this point, and that she doesn't want to put up with some MI6 agent who's just shoved into this at the last minute and might mess something up. So she very much acts accordingly, and it's interesting to note how essentially her frosty demeanor is melted in a way after developing a working relationship with Bond, and knowing that he is not there to essentially wreck the project or have things blow sky high in terms of tension. He is simply there as a troubleshooter. However, it is apparent to Bond, even though he is basically coming in at the last minute, that something is not quite right. There had to be a specific reason why the previous security chief was killed, and he doesn't quite believe the story that was given, and starts uncovering various things that start to add up. Plus, he knows he is being watched, and doesn't necessarily trust any of the German operatives who are working on the Moonraker project. So he essentially can't quite put his finger on what the problem may be, but knows that there is something lurking around. After escaping a death trap, essentially, Bond and Gala essentially uncover, and this is not really a spoiler because you know that Hugo Drax is the villain, that Drax is not who he claims to be, and that his history was quite manufactured, and his plan is not to gift England a fantastic weapons system to elevate them on the world stage, but is instead to destroy Great Britain with the Moonraker rocket by programming it to actually hit and destroy London itself. Meanwhile, he slips away and strikes one essentially for Germany, his actual home country. That is the overall plot that emerges, and Drax's overall scheme. And then the final act is Bond and Gala trying to put a stop to Drax's mad scheme. The final act is where the book is most like a traditional action-adventure story. It's the act that has more of the pulpy elements, but it's also, like the rest of the book, it has more the quality of a slower burn, because the book's pace has proceeded much more naturally than the frenetic, non-stop pace of Live and Let Die. So again, this is very much a definite shift in reaction to the second book. This is Fleming trying something different. And since it's so character-focused, again, I think Moonraker is best explained as having a blending of elements of both Casino Royale and Live and Let Die. But again, the final act is trying to stop the Moonraker and Drax's plot, and is where you get the basically all the action is saved for the final act. The middle of the book is very much cat and mouse goings on at the Drax estate, and trying to uncover what plots may actually be going on, meanwhile allowing for the greater sense of characterization to come through. Drax's actual story is fascinating. Of course, he gets to have the wonderful villain monologue when Bond is threatened with torture and tortured somewhat by Krebs, who is very handy with a blowtorch. This comes after a car chase where Gala has been captured and Bond's Bentley is unfortunately wrecked again. So the car chase is where I think you have the greatest sort of linkage to a moment from Casino Royale. It plays out differently, but the actual setup, and especially because it takes place at night, it is very reminiscent. So it's basically playing on the same concept from the car chase sequence in Casino Royale. But while Drax certainly has certain elements of Le Chiffre in his character makeup, he is very much an original and larger than life, especially when he reveals his backstory of actually being an excellent German soldier, not British soldier, and then how he came to be terribly disfigured, and also how he came to essentially assume the identity of a British soldier and then build his fortune for his own nefarious means. It is a fascinating and beautifully written, essentially flashback as Drax recounts this, and the cherry on the top of the sequence is Bond, well, of course, tied up and already roughed up, listening patiently to all of this, and then immediately insulting Drax multiple times, having a perfect reading of Drax's completely warped psychological makeup. So it is a book that's always about character more than anything else. For those who prefer a Bond novel to have more action like Live and Let Die, or more of a mixture of action throughout, you might be a bit disappointed because Moonraker is such it's more of a slow burning story throughout. It's very much focused on character, but also I think the whole opening act depicting Bond's day-to-day life in London, it sets you up for all of this. It sets you up for the novel being more refined, not necessarily action focused throughout, and also for Galibrand as a love interest to not exactly be a love interest. The Bond heroine of the novel is herself a hero in her own right and a standalone character who doesn't need anything from James Bond. This factor, and the fact that she only first appears in the book much later on, so she's not in basically the entirety of the first act of the book, it gives her essentially less time with the reader, and one might be tempted to write her off a bit compared to Fleming's other heroines, who are much more developed because they have more page count. But Gala is one of Fleming's best female characters, and very important in the development of his writing because she is a very strong and intelligent and excellent policewoman. She is her own agent and can hold her own quite well, and in fact even saves Bond from himself, and is also able to participate and actually save Bond. So she very much holds her own, which is impressive, and this leads into what I think is another absolute standout element of the novel, which is the ending. And to get into a little bit of spoiler territory, those who haven't read the novel, I will put a chapter here so you can skip to the end of this. But the actual ending after the Moonraker launch sees Bond and Gala after everything has died down and they're supposed to get out of the country. Instead of Bond being able to carry out his plans of romancing Gala somewhere in France, she's actually going to be married to a detective, Inspector Vivian. She had worn a ring throughout the book, but the Bond and the reader just kind of assumed it was part of her cover. But it lends such a poignancy to the end of the novel that after the events they had gone through, Gala really did come to care for Bond. They had had this shared experience that had bonded them in that particular way. While each of them may have wanted it to be more, it is very clear that that's all it was. Whether it could have developed more or not is left up to the reader's interpretation. But essentially the book ends with their parting. And so you have a James Bond novel where the Bond girl is her own woman, essentially, and never sleeps with Bond and goes off to marry someone else at the end. And Bond is left to muse over the state of his own life and realize once again that his only companions are his demons. That is the core of the James Bond character right there. Fleming lays it bare, but also writes it so eloquently that, again, the individual reader can take the characters' statements any way they want to in terms of seeing it in slight different ways. But there's such a poignancy there that both characters express such a feeling of regret, and we've come to really love the Gala character because she is so resourceful and intelligent and attractive and feisty, but also sensitive. She's a wonderful, fully formed three-dimensional character. And for us not to get essentially the traditional Bond ending, for us not to get the ending of Live and Let Die, it's very befitting a book that was trying, obviously, to be very different and unique compared to the two books preceding it. So I guess we're alternating at this point. Casino Royale certainly had a downer of an ending. Live and Let Die did not. Moonraker has a downer of an ending, though nowhere near as much of a downer as Casino Royale. But it is a remarkable growth for the not only the writer, but also the character of James Bond. So again, Moonraker is a book that's entirely about character. I would say that it's so strongly about character and atmosphere and England itself that it's more about character and atmosphere than plot necessarily. And that's not a bad thing. If a book is incredibly well done and effective, as Moonraker is, you can have a plot that's more of a slow burner that allows the focus on characterization to flow freely into the elements of the plot. My only real criticism about the book, and this is something I've kind of always felt, even the first time I read it as a kid, the highest dramatic stakes in terms of what the reader remembers most and the most tense parts of the book. Certainly Bond and Gala trying to stop the Moonraker, not only first trying to survive, but also then trying to stop the Moonraker's launch, and then the actual countdown sequence is incredibly tense and beautifully well written, and topped off by an incredibly ironic touch about what actually happens to the Moonraker. But the dramatic highlight of the book is actually the card game at Blades, the game of bridge, because the whole first act of the book builds to that moment, and it has the same incredible dramatic sense of detail where you're in a heightened reality state, as we saw in the card game in Casino Royale. So here Fleming is hitting that same height of dramatic intensity once again, but the problem is it's at the end of the first act of the book, and then everything kind of slows back down, and we don't hit that same dramatic intensity again until Bond and Gala are trying to stop the Moonraker, and then in the launch sequence at the last second. So it gets down to the wire, so you get incredible drama. But honestly, even there, I don't know if it hits quite the same dramatic intensity as the card game of bridge between four men at Blades Gentlemen Club in London. And in particular, it's just a battle of wills between Bond and Drax. And in Bond's internal monologue, he says, forget the Moonraker. This is simply a battle between me and him, and I really don't like this guy, and I'm going to enjoy beating him in his own game and crushing him. So because it's got that personal motivating factor, and we as the reading audience immediately have a dislike of Drax as a character simply due to how he carries himself, that adds that personal connection, I think. And so as a book, it's tough to recover after that level of dramatic intensity coming quite early on. And since the rest of the book until the very end is much more of a slow burner, and the actual story only starts to emerge over time because it's fashioned much more like a traditional mystery, that is definitely an example of where you have such a peak early on that it does take quite a long while to hit a similar one. Basically, the book has two giant dramatic peaks, and probably between those, I'd say the other peak would be the attempt on Bond and Gala's life. That is very much almost successful and is incredibly dramatic. So, but in between those, the book kind of goes back down to more of a simmering level, if you can equate the plot of Moonraker to to having something on the boil on the stove, essentially. So that would be my only real criticism, is that once you get past the card game at Blades, and really the whole first act has such a charge to it, because it's giving the reader all of this detail and then getting you hooked in to the Fleming sweep, as Bond fans like to call it, and building up to the highlight of the game at Blades. Then we come back down, and it takes quite a while to build up to that intensity level. It basically starts all over again. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but I just think it's a particular factor in Moonraker that when you talk about plotting and the Fleming sweep, it's very important to note that happens here, where you have such a peak, and then basically you have the book kind of start all over again, and it takes a substantial amount of time to build up that level of intensity again. So overall, as a third novel, I think Moonraker shows incredible growth once again, in terms of Fleming's confidence as a writer, his further enriching of the James Bond world. I think that's the key word or term to describe Moonraker as a novel. It enriches the James Bond character. It enriches the world of James Bond. It adds so much flavor and context and foundational details that it fuses into the reader's view of James Bond in the literary world and the Fleming canon, that it's material that you carry with you into all the other Bond novels. This is one of the most important books for understanding James Bond as a character, the way Fleming wrote him, and the world that Fleming built in his Bond novels. That's also because the plot itself is more of a slow burner, and it's entirely set within England. So this makes it stand out. It feels unique, and so it makes the book feel fresh, particularly when you're reading the books for the first time in chronological order. Each book is a little bit different, which is what you need in a series. They are different, yet at the core they are the same, because it's the same writer and the same character, but each novel builds upon what the previous books have done. It basically adds to the tracks of the rail line that the previous books have established, but is able to go in different pathways and different directions. So the reader is always entertained, but also getting more of the world and more of the character, and being able to just revel in it and sift through all of the detail and really savor it. This is a book that you get to savor over all the details. You can read it very quickly in one sitting, because Fleming was such a brilliant writer that you don't really want to put the book down. But Moonraker is definitely of the Fleming canon one of the books where you really want to take your time, because that's how you get all of the richness. If you just go through it rather quickly in one sitting, chances are you're not going to get that full, rich quality all the way through. You'll get most of it. You'll get some of it. But if you read Moonraker multiple times, especially over the years, it's a book that very much opens up more and more. So if it's a book that maybe you didn't like so much the first time around because it was so atypical, it's definitely one of the ones that grows the most over rereads. So I think all of those reasons are why it is usually among Bond fans' favorite of the Fleming novels. And also, a lot of these reasons are why it's never been adapted to film exactly as it was written. There are distinct reasons why the various adaptations made various changes, and then also because the book is so locked in to being in the mid-1950s, especially in terms of the technology, it could definitely be seen as a bit old-fashioned or too simplistic when coming to adapting the novel decades down the road, when technology has become so much more advanced. So that's why the book has various unique qualities that make it so distinct, even from other Fleming novels, and that's why it's such a rewarding experience to come back to every time. Now we turn to the adaptations of the novel, and the first is definitely one of the most obscure elements of the world of James Bond, and unfortunately is lost, so all we can do is read a basic description. But there was a South African radio drama version of the novel that actually starred Bob Holness as James Bond. This was presumably the novel condensed down to probably about an hour to maybe 90 minutes, maybe even 2 hours. It's unknown. It's even unknown exactly what year it was done. Generally, it was thought to be done at least in probably about 1958, but I've seen it listed as 56, 57, 58, or even 59. But it's just fascinating to know that this early on, even when the Bond novels themselves had not become the world-shattering successes they would later become when the character was still relatively obscure, that there was a radio drama adaptation. So technically, this is the second major adaptation of James Bond, or one of the Fleming novels, in a audio or visual medium, and unfortunately, it just happens to be lost. But it would be fascinating to have this turn up someday. It would obviously be probably much more faithful than the 1954 CBS Climax television version of Casino Royale, in terms of, I'm sure in the radio version, Bond was not turned into an American agent. And since the novel is so character focused and doesn't leave England and is very much a mystery, it seems a perfect book to translate to radio, and does so actually quite well, which I'll get to when I talk about the BBC version in a bit. So it's just very unfortunate that this fascinating radio adaptation is sadly lost. The second major adaptation is, of course, the Daily Express newspaper strip version, once again with incredible artwork by John McCluskey and written again by Henry Gamage. This ran in 1959, so this came seemingly after the South African radio drama version. Again, following the sort of tradition set by the previous strips, this is a condensed version of the story told in daily newspaper strip form, and manages to hit all of the highlights of the novel. But you do lose something in the translation because it's having to go into the individual strips for each day. So when you are reading these, you have to keep in mind that it was a different style of storytelling, and you're also having to ensure that new readers aren't lost coming in every single day. So it is a different mode of storytelling. What is fascinating is that this does manage, like the strip adaptation of Live and Let Die, to give you every major aspect of the novel and give you the overall thrust of the plot, and it replicates the novel quite well. You just lose out on quite a bit of the texture and the nuance, and because it's interrupted into individual panels, it does take a little bit of getting used to. But of course, back in the 1950s, people were getting these one at a time and not being able to have the luxury of reading a full collection. It's also nice to get a visual representation of the various characters, in terms of, we have Drax actually drawn with the giant handlebar mustache and the hair and things. So that's a nice visual. But if you look closely, we have the incredible John McCluskey version of Bond that was already emerging, and this became the public sort of default image of Bond in terms of what the general public, who had not read one of the novels, but they knew the comic strips from the newspapers, that's what they would think of, the John McCluskey Bond. But the McCluskey Bond is also more in the sort of Sam Spade mold of having the chiseled features and being not a superhero, but the image of a larger-than-life hero. And that does contrast a little bit, at least, with how human Bond is in the Fleming novels. So it is a tiny bit jarring for me, having such a history with Moonraker the novel and seeing those same moments nicely replicated, but having to keep in mind it's the fantastical, heroic version of James Bond in terms of how he looks in the incredible McCluskey version of Bond. It jars a little bit because it's just so much more immediately heroic looking. Now, the other thing is admittedly minor, but it does bug me. So if you look here, here we have Gala Brand, who is beautifully drawn, but is actually a blonde in the strip. And in the novel, she was a brunette. And I know that's a small thing, but I've read the novel so many times over the years that I have this mental picture in my head. And so whenever I read the newspaper strip, it kind of throws me a little bit that suddenly Gala Brand is a blonde. And especially since the next novel, Diamonds Are Forever, has the famous Tiffany case that Fleming created. And she's a blonde. I usually think of the actual Fleming heroines who were blondes when the hair color is ever brought up, if it's ever brought up. I just associate it that way. So it is a little tiny bit jarring that Gala is a blonde in the newspaper strip, although that's really getting into minutia, I admit, but it does bug me a little bit. In terms of the Eon film series and film adaptations of Moonraker, we of course got the Moonraker film of the same name in 1979, which was very much a follow-up to the success of The Spy Who Loved Me. And that's very important to stress because Moonraker is basically a remake of The Spy Who Loved Me film, which had nothing to do really with the source novel of the same name for specific reasons. But Moonraker the film, while it's quite often criticized for delving too far into goofier humor and moments that feel outside of the world of Bond and going into space and having some larger-than-life technology, it is at its core, at least for the first half, relatively straightforward Bond as actual spying work. But you do have Sir Hugo Drax. You have him essentially acting as if he is a good friend to Great Britain and other nations. But instead of it being a missile program, it's essentially his own space shuttle and space program he's developed, that he's sharing technology essentially, but actually has his own nefarious purposes. But the stakes are very much raised because it's 1979, and everyone felt that just having someone with essentially an atomic rocket that he wanted to crash upon London was essentially a bit too tame or a bit too simple for a James Bond film at that point, which is understandable and I think very much correct. That's why it's a novel that lends itself more to being done as a period piece, because it is very much locked to being set in the mid-1950s. So it makes sense why they made changes and why they were very much using the playbook of The Spy Who Loved Me, although The Spy Who Loved Me playbook basically came from You Only Live Twice, so there's an argument to be made that Moonraker the film is a second remake of You Only Live Twice, while also being a remake of The Spy Who Loved Me. But Moonraker does have its own unique flavor, and you have the globe-trotting, so it doesn't have the same locked to England flavor. But we do have a version of Gala Brand. We have a version of Bond going to the Drax estate and knowing that there are dealings going on, and also having to thwart the actions of Drax's very obviously villainous right-hand man, although it's now Cha instead of Krebs. But, you know, there's enough of the elements of Fleming's novel in the film. So they're certainly there if you want to look for them, but it's not obviously adapting Fleming's novel as it was written. And of course, Fleming certainly didn't write Drax having essentially a doomsday plot and also having a secret space station in space. But again, I don't mind that the film does this. I think it definitely had to at that point, and it was trying to capitalize on the success of Star Wars, reinvigorating the science fiction genre. So it was a smart move. It's just that some elements obviously delve too far into goofy humor or are a bit too over the top in terms of not staying grounded and realistic. I don't mind Bond going into space or Drax having a secret space station, but one wishes the film had a bit more of the grounding realism of Fleming's novel, at least peppered throughout. There is quite a bit of that, I would say, in at least the first half of the film. It's really at some point during the Venice sequence halfway through where we start to fully move into the more and more outlandish. But it is a beautifully made film and was the only Bond film made in France due to the British tax laws. So that gives it a unique flavor. Plus, they had a gigantic budget of about $30 million at the time. So all the money is on the screen. It is a globe-trotting, larger-than-life adventure film, the kind of which they don't make anymore and we likely will never see again. So it is very unique, but one does have to give it credit for at least retaining elements of Fleming's novel throughout, but it's just not really doing Fleming's novel at the same time. So that's why you have to actually turn to the tie-in novelization. This was written by the film's screenwriter, Christopher Wood, and you would think that it's a novelization of the film as we have it if you didn't have any knowledge of what this book actually is. This book is actually following Wood's novelization of The Spy Who Loved Me, which he was also a screenwriter on. And like his spy novelization, this is not a novelization of the film per se. This is basically a novelization of the film's plot as if Ian Fleming wrote it with the literary James Bond. So this is basically a Fleming pastiche, just like Wood's spy novel. And for my money, and I know I'm not the only fan who feels this way, out of all the authors and the continuation novels who have tried to imitate Fleming's writing style, especially the books such as Devil May Care that was actually promoted as the author writing as Ian Fleming, out of all the attempts at doing Fleming pastiche, Christopher Wood pretty much nails it in his two novelizations of the films that he wrote on. So these books are really kind of fly under the radar. But essentially, if you can imagine the 1979 film through the filter of Fleming's literary Bond, that's what this book is like. There's also additional materials in terms of scenes and things that were actually shot for the film but deleted, such as more goings-on in the space station. We get more of Drax's actual plot in terms of why he's trying to carry out this doomsday scheme, which is frankly a shame it's not in the film because it adds so much to the character, and it's a particular element that has actually not been used in the film series. We also get another touch from actually an earlier draft where instead of Corinne Dufour in Wood's original script, the Drax associate helicopter pilot who helps Bond and unfortunately becomes the sacrificial lamb was actually the character of Trudy Parker, and she was essentially a Californian girl. And so that's actually the character in the book. So this actually has some of Wood's original draft ideas, but also there are different bits of action because this is basically the literary Bond. There's even a moment that recalls the Goldfinger novel because Bond actually finds out about a particular character death, the death of Trudy, long afterwards, the same as he finds out about the death of Jill Masterson in the Goldfinger novel, because in the novel he doesn't actually find Jill's naked golden corpse as we do in the film. It's one of the film's great dramatic improvements on Fleming, but we actually have Wood replicating Fleming's style, but also some of his stylistic choices. But it's basically recasting the 1979 film into a literary Bond novel. It is a fascinating must-read book. The only problem is this has never been reprinted except for it was reissued as an ebook for a short while, and now that's out of print. So you have to track down these vintage, rather lovely original tie-in paperbacks. But they did these books a disservice by just selling them as a novelization because these are incredible. I don't know what you call them, but they're essentially novelizations of two of the Roger Moore era films, but as Fleming pastiches starring the literary James Bond. They are completely unique. Then we have to look at other Eon films later on that actually used elements of the novel. The first is only a small section in Octopussy, which, like the other films of the 1980s written by Richard Maybaum and Michael G. Wilson, were essentially cherry-picking elements of Fleming materials that had not been used. Mostly they were utilizing the short stories and building them into new narratives, but in Octopussy there's a particular moment in terms of Bond's meeting with Kamal Khan over the backgammon backgammon tables. And Con is introduced as a cheat, and Bond basically exposes and beats him at his own game, getting a ton of money off of Con, to which Con replies with the classic line, "Spend the money quickly, Mr. Bond," which is taken directly from Drax's line at the end of the bridge game in the Moonraker novel. So essentially, the Octopussy backgammon scene and Bond villain confrontation is a transposed version, reworked from the bridge scene. It's just unfortunate that the scene itself in the film is just kind of a one-off, but the build-up you have to take from the auction scene before that, where Bond first locked eyes with Con and bid up the price of the egg, thus earning Con's animosity. And so the backgammon scene is the dramatic payoff of that, and Bond basically further sticking the knife into the villain in terms of beating him in his own game and costing him a lot of money. But it is basically a reworking and borrowing of not only the idea of the bridge scene, but the villain's final line, spoken with lots of venom. And then ultimately, you have to look at Die Another Day, the 20th James Bond film, which actually borrows or lifts elements from, I would say, at least one or two previous James Bond films, but also several different Fleming novels. But in particular, it does replicate the Moonraker plot. So this is really where I think Eon decided that they would actually try and finally adapt Moonraker, the novel, the way it was written. So, of course, in Die Another Day, you have a rich industrialist who's essentially an adopted son of England, who is a self-made man, although how he made his fortune and built up his industrial complex is left up to one's own interpretation. It's very mysterious. But he has promised a great gift to Great Britain to essentially elevate them on the world stage, and gets a knighthood and everything, but of course is actually someone else entirely, and Bond has to stop his nefarious plot to destroy England, but also in the film, South Korea, because he is actually the North Korean who we saw in the pre-title sequence, whose schemes were thwarted by Bond, and now he's basically re-emerged years later with a completely different face. So that is utilizing the Drax character and the overall plot of Moonraker the novel, but putting it into a completely different framework and giving the character extra motivations by making him a rogue North Korean instead of a rogue German, thus trying to essentially modernize the mid-1950s plot to 2002. So it's another example of the writing team of Purvis and Wade pulling something from Fleming that hadn't exactly been used, but also sort of trying to twist it on its head and give it a new spin, essentially. So Die Another Day is where Eon actually does Moonraker the novel, although it's so mixed into other elements, and it's Die Another Day. It's not exactly immediately recognizable at first unless you're actually thinking about these things. So I can understand people not always making that connection. But you even have a version of the bridge scene, and it actually takes place at Blades, but it's actually now transformed into the fencing scene. And we even have the replication of Bond trying to stick the knife into Gustav Graves in terms of holding up the diamond and basically invoking that Bond knows that Graves is not exactly what he seems to be, and that he's out to essentially get him at his own game. So basically the fencing scene is a super hyped up version of the bridge scene, and it's set in the same club at Blades, so the association is made very apparent. If that were not enough, we have Bond then going to the villain's establishment, except now it is the Ice Palace, and instead of the Moonraker, it is the Icarus Project, and we have the character of Miranda Frost, who is actually an MI6 agent who was placed with Graves to sort of oversee things and has had not much to report, and she has a very frosty demeanor. The difference is the actual allegiances of the Frost character are different from Gala Brand, and the idea originally was to actually have her named after Fleming's heroine. So basically doing a version of Fleming's character while also not doing Fleming's character. I'm actually actually very glad they didn't name her Gala. I'm glad it was Miranda Frost, because I think that would have done Fleming's character a disservice, and I think that's definitely one of the elements from the Bond novels that really should be in one of the films. I think Fleming's Gala Brand definitely deserves to be in one of the films. It's just unfortunately not quite happened. I also think there's at least some degree of influence on the later continuation novels, where I think there's definitely a number of Fleming titles that seem to at least have influence on certain books, but in particular what springs to mind is I do think there's at least some degree of Moonraker's style and some degree of influence on John Gardner's first novel, License Renewed, from 1981. Not only is Bond going to a country estate owned by the villain and basically having to live on the estate for some time with potential nefarious goings-on, but the lead villain himself of Anton Murek does have quite a number of Drax parallels. So I think of the continuation books, I think there's definitely a degree of Moonraker influence on a number of them, but especially License Renewed. However, there is one more adaptation we have to talk about, which is the 2018 BBC radio version. This is part of the same BBC series that did a Live and Let Die adaptation that I covered in my last video. So that means it stars Toby Stephens as James Bond and features, I believe, most of the same production team, and is very much in the same style. So it's the novel in 90 minutes, essentially distilled down for radio broadcast. So that means a great number of scenes are jettisoned in order to get the story down to just 90 minutes, and everything is slightly tweaked and rewritten to better facilitate it being for radio and thus audio only. In terms of the adaptation, I think it's a fine adaptation overall, but again, it's amazing to see how much more of the book you get in the newspaper strip version as opposed to a 90-minute radio broadcast. I do think it is better overall than the Live and Let Die adaptation. I think here the voice cast is all excellently chosen and very well directed. Again, Toby Stephens makes for a very solid Bond of the radio, and I'm very excited to hear the other episodes because his take is very much Fleming's Bond, but also with enough energy to make the dialogue play for a radio audience and for condensing the action of the novel down to 90 minutes. With Live and Let Die, my issue was that all of the American character voices just sounded off. I don't know if it's because they were all having to use obviously British actors or what it was exactly, but it just didn't feel quite right, particularly for Felix Leiter and others. So here, that's not an issue. The only issue with direction I have in terms of the voice cast is that they took Fleming's mention of Peter Lorre describing Krebs literally, because the actor is basically directed to do a Peter Lorre impression for all of Krebs's dialogue, and it is very distracting. And I myself do a Peter Lorre impression. I think most everybody does, but that doesn't necessarily mean it works in the context of the story, and it was a bit much, essentially. It's not terrible, you can kind of look past it, but it is distracting. Another thing is that some of the things they included in terms of how the scenes were written and what they chose to focus on was a bit perplexing. Basically, we have entire sections of the story skipped over, and the entire opening is different in order to cram in Drax's backstory and get the story moving immediately, pretty much. So essentially, we have a mashup of the scenes where M asks Bond to investigate Drax cheating at cards as a personal favor, essentially, and also M and Bond going over Drax's history and setting up the overall case. But in doing so, while it's a very wise move for time, they felt it necessary to insert a scene of Q struggling to set up a 16mm projector to show a newsreel about Drax, and Bond having to help thread a reel. So that was unnecessary and out of place. So the one or two new little tiny pieces are just kind of for fluff, and also unnecessary attempts at comedy. So it would have been better to just get an extra piece of the novel that had not been used, and instead of an attempt at sort of humor. There's one or two other little tweaks which are fine and don't really change anything, but we do lose basically the whole build up at Blade, so we don't get Bond and Nim's dinner. We basically just essentially cut to the chase and get very quickly to the card game, which does remove a lot of the sense of character and atmosphere, unfortunately. We also don't get much about Bond's day-to-day life because everything's having to squeeze down to 90 minutes. So unfortunately, it makes the story much more simplistic. It's basically hitting the same beats, but it doesn't have the same texture, and a few moments are... They're a little bit jarring if you're used to the novel. In particular, during the bridge game, Bond in the novel drinks quite heavily because he's trying to look essentially a bit tipsy or drunk in order to have Drax underestimate him. Whereas in the radio adaptation, they actually have Bond full-on play drunk. He not only drinks heavily to look drunk, they have him actually play drunk, and it's a bit too much. It works within the context of the scene, but it's a bit on the nose and too much for me, and so it was definitely one of those little jarring moments. But on the flip side, we finally have a lot of scenes of Fleming dialogue for Drax and other characters, and most of all for Gala Brand, that is finally being enacted. And in particular, I really enjoyed actually getting to experience some form of Fleming's Gala Brand in some adaptation, doing some of the dialogue and quite fitting for her character. So that was really nice. And also for Drax to give a version of his villain's monologue. So overall, it's a positive listen. I think every Bond fan should listen to the BBC radio adaptations. And I love radio dramas myself. So the idea of adapting Fleming's novels to the radio medium is a very fantastic one, and something that I would hope somebody might try again, and maybe without the 90-minute constraint, because that is the biggest problem, that they have to squeeze everything down into 90 minutes. It's an admirable project and done well. I just could have done without the one or two little embellishments that really kind of were unnecessary and felt out of place, and one or two things felt a little off, I would say. And most of all, I could have done without Krebs being basically a Peter Lorre impression. Other than that, it's solid, and I do think it is actually better than the Live and Let Die adaptation. I think it has less of those asides, and you also don't have the issue, I think, with the American characters in the Live and Let Die adaptation sounding out of place. But I will also mention one or two of the little musical cues, like the Live and Let Die adaptation, do feel a little bit out of place for where they're used, but there are less of them. So again, I think this is a better adaptation and radio drama than the Live and Let Die one. I think it improves in certain areas, and overall it was very nice to be able to hear a version of Fleming's novel. Now to talk about some selected artworks and cover designs for different editions of Fleming's novel. We of course start with the original UK Johnathan Cape first edition, which has probably the most iconic cover, which is the title Moonraker in a sort of stencil form in a sea of flames that also has Fleming's name coming out in a really nice bold black font. And of course this is to indicate, I would assume, the tail fire of the Moonraker rocket itself. It's a very simple but striking and unbelievably effective cover. I think it's one of the best of the Johnathan Cape UK originals, and probably, again, the most iconic cover. But we do have a very strong American first edition from Macmillan on this beautiful black background cover. We have the title in green in a nice stylized font with the Moonraker itself literally crossing through the title. We have various lines and arrows, I think, to sort of indicate the pathways of the missile or other Moonrakers, of course, but also tying into the theme that comes about of the gyros and the controls and the flight plan and the eventual destination of the Moonraker. So it plays into the plot, but nicely we have this skeleton hand coming in from the left to hit the origin point, which is colored red and a circle. So it is literally essentially resembling Drax's hand of death going to hit the fire button of the Moonraker rocket. It is a really simple but very effective cover, just like the Johnathan Cape UK cover. And I think this is an example of where the US first edition is frankly equally strong. Maybe not as immediately arresting, but still an exceptional cover. And I think like the US cover of Live and Let Die for the first edition, the US first edition of Moonraker is exceptionally strong. In terms of paperbacks, we have a number of iconic pan UK paperbacks. The first, from 1956, has this wonderful artist depiction of Bond and Gala inside the Moonraker complex at the climax of the book as they're struggling to figure out how to stop Drax's nefarious schemes. But then we turn to the US Perma books paperback from 1958, and similarly to the Live and Let Die cover that they did for that novel, this has a very pulpy cover. All of the early Bond novels in the US, they didn't seemingly know how to sell them. Some were retitled, as Moonraker was here, as Too Hot to Handle. But of the early books, this is the one where they really tried their darndest to essentially rebrand it, because this is also the one book that was essentially Americanized. All of the British idioms and spellings and things were completely removed, and apparently this edition had altered text in terms of trying to Americanize it, in addition to changing the title. Then in 1960, Pan returned with an updated cover, and this one I think is actually an improvement on the first one, because we have Bond and Gala and the Moonraker again on the cover. But here, Bond and Gala have their clothes torn. They're obviously in utter dread and terror. This is how they really look and feel and sound in the climax of the book, whereas the first Pan cover, it looks great, but they're fully clothed and not under duress, it seems, or not that much. But then we did also get a 1960s Signet cover here in the US, which is a really incredible design. This has a version of Gala Brand in the actual tailfire of the Moonraker that's lifted off, and a wonderful bold orange background, and of course the title in a nice arresting green. And this seems to be the sort of impetus for the later Signet cover image, basically doing an updated version of this really striking artwork. Then in 1961, Pam would do another update, basically flipping the image and putting the Moonraker on the left and basically making it look a little more modern, and then doing another version of Bond and Gala under duress, worrying about how they're going to stop the Moonraker. Then in 1965, we got a very stark but wonderful example of the mid-60s UK pan James Bond style, in terms of having James Bond in a big black font on the cover and having a very simple, stark image to suggest the story within. Here, it's just a shot of the Moonraker coming up from the surface to reach the Earth's orbit. And then we have the Signet reissue from 1965. This is my favorite edition. This is the edition I always think of because this is what I grew up with. In fact, this particular copy, it's a little bit worn, as you can see, but with the beautiful painting by Barry Phillips, again, basically doing another version of the first Signet cover. So we have Gala Brand here, but now brandishing a gun in front of the Moonraker lifting off and having the wonderful tailfire leave this big explosive trail. So it just really is attention grabbing, and I've always loved this cover design. I was able to finally get a really mint condition copy so you can see it as it's meant to be seen, and with really bold color, as this hasn't had any fading. This has, of course, the iconic red-edged Signet pages, and I think the equally iconic rear of the Signet with the beautiful design mentioning other titles, and this being one of the updated later ones, as it has the mention of Fleming's death in 1964. Of course, we have the classic Signet spine with the title in green, the title page in the Signet style, and then a beautiful little heading for each chapter and the sections of the book. To mention a few more, in 1973, Bantam did a new printing of Moonraker, similar to their other 1970s covers with a beautiful James Bama artwork. But this one is a departure in that it takes a sort of, for lack of a better term, almost a sort of trippy design aesthetic, but in and of itself is really well done. It's got a great use of color. The actual art style looks really good. It's just that this is not exactly the novel. Bond looks very 70s, of course. We have a beautiful red-haired woman on the front who is not in the story at all. And the villain here, I guess, is supposed supposed to be Drax or maybe Krebs, but it looks a little different. But he is bald and has the mustache and a sort of outfit that I guess is for working in the rocket plant. But we do have Bond seemingly in his Bentley during the car chase. So, there's enough, I suppose, to suggest that this is a cover for Moonraker, but it does look great. It's also quite uncommon, so I've only seen this in person once, and it was quite expensive. So this is just one of the really unique ones I think stands out. Berkeley Books did a Moonraker reissue in 1985 as part of their reissue of Fleming novels during the Gardner era, and so it has the John Gardner style cover for the US editions, but here it's on a plain black background with a very plain silhouette for Bond, so it's definitely the one that stands out the most of all the 80s paperbacks, but it's also the rarest because I guess they only printed a small amount of them. This is one of those editions that I've simply never seen. I've only seen pictures of it online, and it's one that would definitely jump out because it's on an all-black background. Jove Books did a slightly more pulpy action-type cover with a lot of nice orange and some decent likenesses, although it looks like they're trying to make Bond a little Roger Moore-ish, but at least Drax does have red hair and looks kind of like Drax, and the woman on the cover looks ostensibly like Galibrand. We have a version of the Moonraker, but again, very much updated and modernized looking, because it's trying not to let you know this is a book from the 1950s. Then, as part of the 2002 Penguin paperback relaunch, we got the beautiful covers that are all matching. So the one for Moonraker is, of course, by Richie Fahey, and keeps in the same sort of design aesthetic where we have an image of the villain in the background and the front cover now behind the Moonraker rocket that looks very 1950s in terms of its aesthetics, and then we have Galibrand here on the front and a very suggestive pulpy type artwork design, and with the ripped blouse and looking in peril, so it very much goes back to the covers of the UK Pan paperbacks and is exactly how one pictures Galibrand at the climax of the story. And we again have a nice usage of a sort of otherworldly green, so for whatever reason I think all of us kind of agree that when you think of Moonraker there's usually got to be some green on the cover, but this is one of these wonderful Penguin covers that are suggestive of the novel perfectly, but also beautiful in their own right, but also have nice subtlety to them that the more you stare at it, the more you find to like about it. Unfortunately, we then saw a variety of very generic covers. The 2002 Penguin UK paperback series was some of the most generic Bond covers there are. It's usually a static sort of image with some sort of color. So here for Moonraker, it's what seems to be a line or an edge of a piece of steel or something, or maybe it's trying to suggest the sun coming up around the edge of the moon as we see in the 1979 film. I'm not sure. Basically, this series of covers, you can always kind of stare at them, and for the most part, you don't quite know what they're supposed to be indicative of. But yeah, it's a cover. It at least looks kind of okay, I suppose. The next one from 2004, also from Penguin, is at least suggestive of some kind of event, but as you can see, it's just a car blurred in motion going past the camera. So one can only assume it's supposed to be referencing Bond's Bentley speeding after Drax during the car chase, but again, it's a blurred photo of a car driving past a camera. That's not a book cover right there. Yeah, so these two are rather unfortunate, but unfortunately we're going to get worse, much worse. We did get better for a little while. In 2009, Penguin unveiled the series of covers all featuring lovely color-tinted portraits of various women in states of undress, of course, because it's a Bond novel. You have to have a fun, suggestive cover. Here, I suppose it's suggesting Galibrand maybe, but these covers just kind of had female figures on them with the actual title and Fleming's credits sort of almost tattooed on them. So it's not necessarily indicative of anything from the book, but at least it's a nice image and fits as part of the series. Then in 2012, as part of the vintage line, Penguin did this Bond walking through London in the fog cover, which is okay, but it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the book, and it's also quite generic, but at least it's something, I suppose. They did a variety of covers like this as well. One was literally just a theater marquee, so yeah, you can see how we're getting much more generic as time goes by, but at least there are some that have some color and flavor to them, as we see in the next vintage cover, which is this yellow background with a 50s looking sort of rocket to suggest the Moonraker and a stylized version of the title. So at least this has some flair to it, but it also looks more like a children's book, I would argue. Then the 2012 Thomas and Mercer cover is part of the overall series using black, white, and red. Basically is having a version of a target indicator with the 007 logo in the center. So it's very simple. It works. It does connect with the story's themes enough, I suppose, but I've never been a fan of these covers all that much, but at least each one does have something to do with the book, sort of, and it's part of an overall design aesthetic. And then we come to the modern reprints done in 2023 by Ian Fleming Publications in the UK and Harper Collins here in the US. The Fleming Estate edition in the UK has the large 007 logo and is part of their overall nude set of cover designs with the same aesthetic. Here it's just the seemingly the Moonraker and its tailfire going through the 007 logo in the clouds. It's at least it's a scene from the book, and it has an overall design aesthetic that matches the others, but it's not very attention grabbing, actually, and I think rather generic, but at least not as generic as the American cover that basically tries to do the same sort of shot of a missile, but even worse, and that one literally is generic. Of course, the other issue with these two books in terms of the modern US and UK printings is that the Fleming estate did make the decision to go and censor or edit all of the James Bond novels, and do so in a variety of different ways. None were consistent, nor was it actually revealed what changes they made. And on top of that, they seem to kind of do it at different levels in different books, and supposedly some books were not touched at all, but all of them carry the same disclaimer warning. So I would advise everyone to avoid all of the modern US and UK editions in order to avoid getting a censored or altered version of the original text, although I don't know exactly what they would have objected to in Moonraker, since it is not one of the novels with more dated contents. But again, it seems like they kind of went through the books at random, plus we're not told what they actually changed. But not only are the covers of the new US and UK editions, unfortunately, very generic and underwhelming, but they are also the tweaked, edited, or censored book text, so they are to be just avoided completely. Then we come to the US HarperCollins edition, which not only has the unfortunate, very generic logo, font design, and layout of all of these paperbacks, which are also very cheaply made, and definitely the worst looking, most unimpressive series of releases for the James Bond books that I think have ever been printed. And of course, they have the censored and altered text as well. But here, everything is made worse by the fact that we have a very generic image of not even a rocket, but a missile, and a modern missile at that, basically doing a similar path and arching direction as the UK new cover. But this is actually a stock photo. This is a stock photo that you can find on Shutterstock, and it's not even one you have to search very hard for. We've talked about this in the fan community since the mock-up first came out, but all of the new HarperCollins covers are this same terrible generic design for these awful generic printings of the edited and censored text. But here on Moonraker, the image doesn't fit the book at all. It's not even the same type of device. It's being launched from the sea, it seems, so there's water there in the background. But it's a stock image. which they literally just got from Shutterstock or another service. You can actually go buy the rights to use this same photo yourself. It literally took no time for someone to just click buy image. And frankly, I don't know how you can do worse than that, because every other cover at least had somebody trying, even if it was a blurred shot of a car or just a black and white silvery type background that you don't know what it was, or every other version, even the American Too Hot to Handle paperback had nice artwork, even if it changed the novel's title and the cover image had nothing to do with the book. This is the worst of the Harper Collins covers because it is so blatantly obvious that literally no one cared. This is the worst of the worst and has the censored or altered text. So just avoid this version at all costs. However, if you are new to Fleming or you're wanting a modern edition you can go actually purchase that it has lovely artwork and does have the original text of the novel, you can look at the beautiful edition from the Folio Society, which has beautiful artwork by Faye Dalton, is part of their overall series of Fleming's novels, and comes in a deluxe slipcase. It is unfortunately a bit pricey at about $80 US, but it is definitely the most premium version currently available, and the Folio Society editions are the only currently available versions that do not have the altered and censored text. So those are my thoughts and feelings on Ian Fleming's third James Bond novel, Moonraker from 1955, its various book editions, cover artwork designs, and adaptations in other mediums. It is another remarkable effort, and also, like the previous two books, this is a classic in the Fleming canon. It builds the world of Bond even further by taking elements that worked in the previous two novels and fashioning them into something entirely new. As with Live and Let Die, it's amazing to see how Fleming was growing in confidence even further as a writer, how his prose was further refining itself, how his style had fully emerged and kept growing. He wasn't one to rest on his laurels, and that is to be commended and is very much evident here, because Moonraker is not a copy of either Live and Let Die or Casino Royale. It is reflective of those two books. It builds upon them. It has elements of each, but it has a completely different type of story. It takes a left turn. It keeps Bond locked away in England entirely. It is part character study, but also part action-adventure pulp story. So it manages to take both the styles of the previous two novels, but fashion them into something that could be considered an English countryside mystery in a way. So it's Fleming getting to have fun essentially in a different sort of genre, while using that as an opportunity to further Bond's characterization and further enrich the world around the character. It moves at a deliberately slower pace, which may be not to everyone's taste, but the entire book is so effective and so rewarding for the reader that I don't think anybody really minds all that much, and it very much suits the literary Bond. You don't necessarily have to always have great bombast in a James Bond novel for it to be fully successful. For these reasons, and the, of course, time setting of the book in 1955 and the technology involved, it's understandable why when the films got around to actually adapting Moonraker, that they decided the book was too simple and too outdated to translate into the films by the time of the late 1970s, given what the series had done already up to that point. It's also understandable why they would then choose to finally use some of those elements in other films, most notably as essentially the main plot of Die Another Day once you get past the opening sequence. So for all intents and purposes, if you ever wondered why Ian had not adapted Moonraker, well, they basically did in Die Another Day. It's just not really in the same exact form. As a James Bond adventure and as one of Fleming's novels, I do think Moonraker is one of Fleming's best novels. It is extremely suspenseful, but it is also a beautiful character study of Bond and Bond's world, and it's still a sign of Fleming not being afraid to surprise us as the readers. If you read the first two novels and you come to Moonraker expecting globetrotting, well, you're not going to get that. Expecting love scenes, well, you're not going to get that. Expecting the extreme action of Live and Let Die, well, you're not going to get that. but the novel is just as good as the first two, but in different ways. So in terms of trying to play the ranking game, I find it very difficult to do with the Fleming novels. It's very much it becomes a matter of personal preference and what sort of style of Fleming's Bond do you prefer? The earlier, more energetic and very plot-driven novels, whether they be out-and-out action novels like Live and Let Die, or more character studies like Casino Royale and Moonraker being a sort of blending of the two, culminating in From Rush with Love? Or do you prefer the later novels that have that more literary feel to them, or aspiring for that in You Only Live Twice or On Her Majesty's Secret Service, for example? So basically, the books kind of fall into two different camps, and different fans have their own opinions, but everyone is seemingly able to agree that Moonraker is an exceptional novel and is one of the highlights of the Fleming Bond canon. It's just a book that takes a lot of risks and dares to do something different, and also dares to have a more focused story that never leaves the country of England, and allows the space for more character analysis and reflection, and allowing the deepening of the world, because the reader is able to just savor all of these details and enjoy the ride, as Fleming's prose is just swinging for the fences. And you get the sense that he has done the first two books, and now in the third book, he has enough confidence as a successful writer. Well, not that the books were very successful at this point when he was writing it, but now that he had two books behind him, you get the sense that as a writer, he's sort of stretching out and trying some new things, seeing what works, but he's still got that initial spark of excited creativity of, hey, I think I can do this. Now I've done it twice. Now I'm going to do it for the third time. And, essentially the appeal hadn't quite worn off. It hadn't become a chore to think of a new plot yet, or he wasn't trying to reinvent the wheel as he would do sometimes in the later novels, which again have a different sort of focus and style. That's why the books are sort of split into two camps. Basically, the first half of the books and then the second half have a sort of distinct line drawn between them in terms of their styles. But Moonraker is definitely an about face from what you expect from the cinematic Bond. And so people who come to the literary Bond for the first time, Moonraker, the novel, is usually the one that definitely surprises them the most, because it's so different, it's so focused on character and atmosphere, and again, it never leaves England. So if someone were to read a James Bond novel for the first time and they weren't going chronologically, Moonraker would actually be a great novel to try out, as it gives you the full experience of the literary Bond, but in a very focused manner. So as always, I hope my babblings about the world of James Bond, the incredible writing and masterworks of Ian Fleming, and also, of course, collecting James Bond books has been at least somewhat fun and informative. In the next video, I'll be diving, of course, into Diamonds Are Forever, where Fleming goes back into globetrotting adventure territory, and also more of the out-and-out action thriller as we saw in Live and Let Die. So what he plays around with here in Moonraker does, I think, translate at least a small amount, and especially in terms of the stronger female love interest characterization. I do think there's at least some influence of having the stronger Gala Brandon Moonraker on the stronger Tiffany Case character in Diamonds Are Forever. But otherwise, Diamonds Are Forever is a bit more reflective of the style of Live and Let Die. So it's an interesting sort of shift to go into, which I will discuss in my next video on Diamonds Are Forever. So as always, keep supporting your local independent bookstores by hopefully being able to pick up a lovely vintage edition of Moonraker to add to your collection. Keep reading print books, keep bonding, and as always, thank you ever so much for watching. And remember, the 238s roared simultaneously.